You wake up, and you're itchy, very itchy. Something has crawled into your left ear and taken up residence. Possibly a flea, possibly something worse. Either way, it's decided this is home now, and you're not invited to the homeowners association meeting. You slap your head, gently, because under your thick linen head wrap, you're not entirely sure if it's a bug or just the fabric brushing your scalp. Spoiler, it's both. You're in a small, smoky room, and you're wearing everything. A full tunic, wool leggings, undertunic, a belt with your knife, because of course you sleep with a knife, and yes, a tightly wrapped head covering. Not because you're cold, although you are. Not because you're fashionable, although your look could be described as damp medieval peasant chic. You wear it because everyone does. Even indoors. Even to bed. And not wearing one would make people think you're either ill, possessed, or French. None of which is ideal. Welcome to the Middle Ages. It's scratchy. And yes, you'll be keeping that head covering on. All the time. Indoors, outdoors, in the bath, which you won't be seeing this month, and definitely when you meet someone important like a priest or your local baron who collects taxes and questionable jewelry made of teeth. So before you settle into this rickety straw bed of ours, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoyed this strange little corner of the internet where history meets insomnia. Let me know in the comments what time it is where you are and what weird thing you're wearing right now, bonus points if it's medieval appropriate. I'm genuinely fascinated by where you're all tuning in from, and who else is lying in bed listening to the story of why a bunch of muddy serfs insisted on wrapping cloth around their skulls like they were all recovering from brain surgery. Now, let's go ahead and ruin your sleep with some soothing facts and vaguely unsettling context. First, let's start with the obvious. People in the Middle Ages were obsessed with hats, coifs, hoods, veils, wimples, caps, kerchiefs, and other fabric origami for your skull. Some were practical, some were religious, and some were just fashion statements for people who'd never seen a mirror and thought hot was a temperature and not a compliment. Your average medieval person didn't stroll around with their luscious locks flowing in the wind like a shampoo commercial. That would be indecent, sinful, downright scandalous. Hair, in their minds, was a bit like sex. Everyone had it, no one talked about it, and if you showed too much of it in public, the clergy got extremely nervous. If you were a woman, especially, your head was basically considered a sinful beacon of temptation. Uncovered hair meant loose morals. And by loose, I mean you probably owned more than one pair of shoes and didn't cry when a chicken died. So yeah, scandalous. And if you were married, showing your hair was the medieval equivalent of wearing a bikini to a funeral. Not only did it mean you were immodest, it meant you were practically inviting trouble. Possibly French trouble. But covering your head wasn't just about sin. It was about survival. Because medieval Europe wasn't just a place, it was a smell. A damp, smoky, poorly ventilated collection of huts, castles, and regrettable bodily fluids. And your head? Your precious, lice-infested scalp? That was prime real estate for vermin. Lice, fleas, and other tiny freeloaders loved the medieval head. And without Google or shampoo, your options were limited. So you covered it. Constantly. With layers. Linen coifs, tied snugly under the chin like a sad Victorian toddler. Wool caps, sometimes leather if you were feeling edgy. These layers didn't eliminate lice, but they made you feel like you were doing something about it, which is really the most medieval approach possible. Because doing something badly was always preferable to doing nothing well. And here's the real kicker. Those head coverings weren't just about modesty and hygiene. They were status symbols. Like medieval Gucci. The fabric, the quality, the embroidery. It all screamed, I'm slightly less poor than you, peasant. A well-made coif could be the difference between being mistaken for a servant and being mistaken for a slightly wealthier servant. Let's take you to a bustling medieval town, say York in the 13th century. You're standing in the market square, surrounded by mud, pigs, and the smell of 3-week-old fish stew. You look around. Every man, woman, and child has their head covered. Even babies. Especially babies. No one knows why. Possibly aesthetic. Possibly warmth. Possibly because the baby's head was considered too fragile for sunlight, reality, or the judgment of God. Men might be wearing a soft linen cap under their felt hoods, or a coif tied under the chin like an anxious bank robber. or maybe even a hat with a feather in it if they're feeling fashionable and or are in the early stages of a midlife crisis. Women, on the other hand, have a whole architectural masterpiece on their heads. A linen veil draped over a stiff wimple, secured with pins that have probably drawn blood at least once. If they're noble, they might have a crespine, a sort of head cage that looks like someone tried to make a birdhouse out of string. It's not comfortable. But then again, neither is feudalism. And yes, they wore all of this inside, because indoors in the Middle Ages was still kind of outdoors with a roof. Your house is basically one room. Stone or wattle and daub walls, a dirt floor, and windows that are holes you've plugged with sheep stomach lining. Cozy. And if you're a noble, you might have a second room for dying in. But still, you're wearing your head covering in bed, at meals, during prayer, and yes, probably while using the chamber pot. Because removing it would be uncouth. Or cold. Or both. Let's talk hygiene. Because no, your scalp is not clean. Not even a little. You haven't bathed in, well, let's just say the moon has changed phases multiple times. Your head wrap smells like sweat, smoke, boiled onions, and theological despair. But you keep it on. Because lice don't like the light. And neither do your neighbors when they catch a glimpse of your bare scalp. They gasp like you've shown them your ankles. Or your taxes. And even the church had opinions. Of course they did. If something existed, the church had thoughts about it. And those thoughts usually included shame. Uncovered heads in sacred spaces? Unthinkable. Women had to cover their heads in church or risk being mistaken for harlots, pagans, or worse, Italians. Men, weirdly, were expected to remove their hats in church. But outside of prayer, pop that coif back on, buddy. The Lord may be watching, but so are your neighbors. Now, let's say you're a monk. Congratulations, you've chosen a life of prayer, poverty, and mild malnutrition. You also shave a literal bald spot onto your head in a style called a tonsure, because medieval fashion is suffering, and nothing says I've renounced worldly pleasures like a giant circle of scalp surrounded by fuzz. But even monks wore hoods or coifs indoors, especially in drafty monasteries where the walls whispered cold air and judgment at all hours. Nuns? Layers on layers. Veil, wimple, and often a stiff undercap to keep everything in place. Because nothing says chastity like 3 layers of linen and the sound of your own breathing echoing off your ears. The point is, covering your head indoors wasn't optional. It was expected. Like plague. Or losing your teeth at 30. Now, let's talk about class. Because the rules weren't the same for everyone. If you were a wealthy merchant, you might afford fancy caps trimmed with fur. Which sounds luxurious until you remember that fur came from animals that were probably also in your soup. You might wear a chaperone, a kind of turban-looking contraption that was once a hood but got restyled by accident, like when you accidentally turn your hoodie into a crop top in the wash. Fashion is strange like that. And if you were poor, you made your own head covering, out of scraps, or stole one from someone's laundry, or just reused the same one until it could stand up by itself. The more your hat resembled a crumpled napkin, the lower your status. That's just medieval logic. The irony is that nobody questioned it. Covering your head was as normal as breathing, or dying of a minor scratch. If you didn't do it, people assumed something was wrong with you, that you were sick, or grieving, or French. And none of those were good options. Even in art, head coverings were everywhere. Saints wore them. Sinners wore them. Kings wore crowns, yes, but often had padded caps underneath because metal is uncomfortable and your skull has feelings too. Illuminated manuscripts show every figure, even the guy being stabbed in the kidney, wearing a tidy little coif. Because dignity, apparently, is eternal. Of course, not every society was the same. In warmer climates like parts of southern Italy or the Iberian Peninsula, head coverings were still common but varied more. You might see colorful scarves or light fabrics, especially among women. But even there, the idea of bareheadedness was reserved for children, the mad, or statues. Occasionally all 3. We haven't even touched on sumptuary laws yet, those delightful little regulations that told you what you could and couldn't wear based on your class. That's right. The medieval version of fashion police was actual police. Depending on where you lived, there were rules about what colors, fabrics, and accessories you could wear on your head. No, really. You could be fined, or worse, if your hat was too luxurious for your rank. Which is fair. Because nothing threatens the social order like a baker in silk. So yes, you wore your head covering inside. And yes, you wore it to bed. And yes, you wore it to your own funeral. Sometimes literally. Because when you died, people wrapped your body, including your head, in linen. One final coif for the road. Off you go, into the afterlife, looking like a freshly baked dumpling. Anyway, it's probably time to roll over and pretend this hay mattress is comfortable. Ignore the Beatles. They're just here for the ambience. You'll keep your coif on, of course. Because you don't want anyone thinking you're immodest. Or unclean. Or heaven forbid, modern. And if you're wondering whether this whole head covering obsession eventually went away, spoiler, not for centuries. But we'll get to that. Eventually. You wake up again. But this time, your face is stuck to something. It's linen. Damp, slightly greasy linen. You've drooled in your sleep, as one does, and now your linen coif has fused to your cheek like a sad, historically accurate bandage. Congratulations, you are now one with your head covering. This is your life now. You and the fabric are in a committed, borderline toxic relationship. There's no divorce. Just sweat and religious guilt. Outside, a rooster screams. Not crows. Screams. As if he knows you have to walk 3 miles today to fetch a bucket of water that tastes like pennies and moss. You sit up on your straw mattress, shake out the fleas, and don't even consider removing your head wrap. Why would you? That would be like removing your personality. Or your shame. It's part of you now. Let's be clear, people didn't just choose to wear head coverings indoors. It wasn't some cozy personal choice, like putting on fuzzy socks or lighting a scented candle. It was a full-blown societal expectation, complete with religious implications, legal consequences, and enough social judgment to power a small town through sheer passive aggression. And yet, despite the discomfort, the lice, and the feeling that your head is wrapped in a slightly moist burrito of sin prevention, you keep it on. Everyone does. Even in summer. Even while baking bread in a room that's essentially a fireplace with furniture. And if you're wondering why we're spending 3 hours discussing headwear, it's because this is sleep history. The more detail, the better. The more pointless, the sleepier. That's the goal here. Not just relaxation, but complete historical immersion. Ideally, you'll be dreaming about scratchy linen and Latin prayers in about 30 minutes. If not, just wait until we get to the part about plague hoods. So let's talk religion. Because nothing says fashion choice quite like the looming fear of eternal damnation. You live in Christendom. That means the church has thoughts. And those thoughts are long, complicated, Latin, and probably copied from a monk with bad eyesight. The church taught that women's hair was a source of temptation. Like fruit. Or smiling. Or enjoying yourself. In some interpretations, hair was literally described as a net used by the devil to ensnare the souls of men. That's right. Your unkempt bangs might send someone to hell. Powerful stuff. So if you were a woman, especially a married one, covering your hair wasn't just modesty. It was spiritual safety. For everyone. A sort of holy helmet against lust. It protected the men around you from collapsing into sin every time you flipped your head dramatically, which was hard to do when you had 17 pins holding your veil in place anyway. And yes, the Apostle Paul gets name-dropped a lot in these discussions. In the early Christian writings, particularly in 1 Corinthians, Paul advises women to cover their heads while praying or prophesying. The church, in its wisdom, eventually took this to mean all the time, everywhere, until death. Because nuance was not exactly the medieval strong suit. But it wasn't just Christian Europe. Islamic cultures in the medieval world also emphasized head coverings, though with different styles and meanings. Jewish communities too. In fact, across much of the medieval globe, modesty and head coverings were deeply linked, especially for women. The styles varied. The pressure did not. So, inside your little cottage, or your drafty stone manor if you're lucky, you wear your cap, your veil, your coif, or your wimple because not doing so would be like walking around with your underpants on your head. Except worse. Because underpants weren't invented yet. Which is another discussion we're definitely not having right now. Let's return to the coif. The star of our story. This simple garment, a piece of linen shaped to the skull and tied under the chin, was one of the most common head coverings in medieval Europe. Everyone wore them. babies, peasants, knights, even royalty, though theirs were fancier and often hidden under crowns, hoods, or layers of courtly absurdity. Coifs had many purposes. They kept your hair out of the way. They soaked up sweat. They provided a layer of warmth in the winter. And they were, in many cases, the base layer, like underwear for your head. You'd put it on before your hat, your hood, or your helmet. Kind of like medieval layering, except instead of stylish outerwear, you were going for "please don't let the lice bite today." And yes, lice were a constant. You are never not itchy. You may have noticed that already. People tried things, herbal rinses, combs, prayers, but lice were like taxes, inescapable and deeply annoying. Head coverings offered a little defense, a kind of psychological armor, a message to the lice that said, "Not today, Satan, not today." But let's not forget the psychological angle. Medieval people didn't see themselves as individuals the way modern people do. Your identity was tied to your role, your station, your faith, your family. Clothing wasn't self-expression. It was social obedience. You wore what you were supposed to wear. Anything else was heresy, treason, or fashion-forward blasphemy. And so, indoor head coverings persisted. Through war, through famine, through weddings and funerals and tax season, through childbirth and church services, and Wednesday. The head must be covered. Always. Unless you were a nun removing your cap in church, or a child, or dead. Those were your only outs. Speaking of men, yes, they covered their heads too. All the time. Indoors and out. For warmth, modesty, and fashion. The styles varied wildly, from tight skullcaps to floppy felt hats that looked like someone tried to wear a mushroom. In colder regions, hoods with attached capes, called liripipes, were common. They looked ridiculous. Everyone knew it. No one cared. And those hoods were worn inside, because inside didn't mean what you think it means. Buildings were drafty. Windows were open holes. Fireplaces were optional. Your breath fogged the air indoors as easily as out. The concept of indoors was more theoretical than practical. A symbolic gesture toward warmth and safety. In reality, you were always one poorly sealed doorway away from pneumonia. And warmth wasn't just comfort. It was survival. Hypothermia didn't care if you were in bed. Your house probably didn't have insulation. Your blanket was a thin wool sheet filled with anxiety and chicken feathers. Your hat, coif, cap, or hood was the only thing keeping the heat in your body from leaking out through your skull like steam from a forgotten soup pot. Oh, and about that soup, you're having it for breakfast. Again. Because porridge and broth were basically the only things that passed for food among the peasantry. Don't worry, though. If you're lucky, there might be an onion in it. And a fly. Which is a protein, if you squint. You're sitting at the table, still wearing your head covering, as is everyone else. Because it's mealtime. And mealtime is sacred. You say a quick prayer, eat in silence, and absolutely do not remove your coif. To do so would be unhygienic and possibly disrespectful to God, the cook, and your neighbor who has a tendency to cough directly into the breadbasket. Even when you sleep, your head stays wrapped. Especially in winter. You don't have a fireplace in your bedroom. You don't have a bedroom. You sleep in the main room, near the hearth if you're lucky, near the latrine bucket if you're not. Either way, your hat stays on. You might loosen the ties. Maybe. But you don't take it off. Because that would mean exposing your scalp to the cold. And possibly to the judgment of your mother-in-law who shares the bed and has very strong opinions about modesty and sin. Now, let's take a quick journey out of your little peasant cottage and into a monastery. Because if there's one thing monks loved more than God, it was head coverings. The monastic tonsure, the shaved circle on the crown of the head, was a sign of humility and religious devotion. But guess what? It also made your head very cold. So monks wore caps and hoods constantly. Indoors. During prayers. While copying manuscripts. Even during meals, unless their superior gave them the stink eye, which happened a lot. A shaved scalp in a stone abbey was essentially an invitation to freeze to death while transcribing the Book of Psalms. In fact, some orders required very specific headwear. The Cistercians, known for their strict lifestyle and general vibe of quiet suffering, wore simple linen or wool coifs under their cowls. The Benedictines had rules about when to remove or keep hoods on. It was all very precise. Because God cared about your hat, apparently. Or at least, the abbot did. Same thing, really. Even when bathing, on the rare occasion it happened, people sometimes kept a head covering on. Not a full one, mind you, but a cloth to keep the wet hair from scandalously flopping around. And remember, bathing wasn't daily. Or weekly. It was more like a special event. Like your birthday. Or a comet. All of this head covering wasn't just habit. It was culture. Deep, embedded, bone-level culture. Removing your head covering in front of others could signal intimacy, rebellion, or worse, illness. Yes, illness. Because if you were sick, people expected you to be bareheaded, pale, sweaty, unwrapped, a beacon of impending death. So if you walked around indoors with your head exposed, you might as well be holding a sign that said, "I'm dying and I want everyone to panic." It's worth noting, too, that women were often buried in their veils and wimples. It was considered indecent for a woman to appear before God with her head uncovered. Imagine that. Spending your whole life covering your hair to avoid temptation and then dying in it, just in case heaven also had a dress code. Let's not forget the sumptuary laws again, because they never stopped being hilarious. In some regions, certain types of head coverings were restricted to the nobility. Embroidered hoods? Nobles only. Colored veils? Better check your tax bracket. These laws were enforced with fines or, in more theatrical cases, public shaming. Because nothing reinforces the rigid social order like telling a fishmonger's wife her wimple is too fancy for her class. So, as you settle back into your slightly damp, probably vermin-adjacent bed, you leave your coif on. Because taking it off would be a statement, a scandal, a health hazard, and also you're cold, and itchy, and slightly hungry again, even though dinner was just more broth and sadness. But you've survived another day in the medieval world. A world where your head covering wasn't just fabric. It was identity, status, morality, protection, warmth, an itchy, symbolic shield against judgment, wind, and lice. And if you think you've heard it all, just wait. Because next, we're heading into noble households, plague years, and courtroom dramas, all tied, somehow, to what you're wearing on your head. But for now, keep your coif on. Get some rest. You'll need it. We're just getting started. You wake up in a bed that is technically not a bed. It's a pile of something organic. Straw, probably. But not fresh straw. This straw has seen things. Things involving rodents. Things involving nighttime sweating, and at least one case of uncontrollable medieval flatulence. You shift slightly and a cloud of dust, or plague spores, who knows, puffs into the air. You inhale. You regret it. But you're not in a cottage anymore. Oh no, this is an upgrade. You, my lice-bitten friend, have ascended the social ladder. Welcome to a noble household. Your station, servant, or maybe companion, or possibly a distant cousin who didn't inherit anything and is now slowly becoming a piece of furniture in some distant hallway. Either way, you're indoors, technically. And yes, you're still wearing your head covering. In fact, everyone here is still wearing their head covering. The noblewoman upstairs, veil. The steward, cap. The cook, scarf. Even the dog has something tied around its neck that looks suspiciously like a head wrap. The fashion is infectious. But don't be fooled, this isn't just about modesty anymore. Now we're entering the world of symbolism, hierarchy, fashion politics, and fabrics that cost more than your entire village makes in a year. Welcome to the upper crust, where covering your head indoors is still mandatory, but now it's also an opportunity. An opportunity to flex on everyone around you with 12 yards of imported silk and a headpiece that doubles as a tax document. Let's begin with a game. It's called, Guess What I'm Wearing on My Head and Why It Makes Me Better Than You. The noblewoman gliding down the hall is wearing a crespine, a delicate, netted hair cage made of gold threads, pearls, and the tears of servants who had to untangle it. It doesn't cover all of her hair, but it gives the impression of control, elegance, and quiet superiority. It whispers, I don't milk cows. I own cows. And also, I haven't experienced back pain since I turned 12 because I've never worked a day in my life. You see, the head covering has evolved. No longer just about piety or protection from the cold, it's now a visual resume. People can read your social rank by glancing at your skull. If your wimple is plain, you're probably a servant or widow. If it's stiffened with starch and lined with embroidery, you're a lady of the court or someone pretending really hard. And if your head is crowned with something that looks like two horns sticking out sideways like antennae on a medieval insect, well, then you've entered the realm of the hennin. Ah, yes, the hennin. Let's pause. The hennin is perhaps the greatest crime ever committed against common sense and vertical clearance. A conical or horned headpiece that stood anywhere from 1 to 3 feet tall and required scaffolding, reinforcement, and possibly divine intervention to wear without injury. These weren't everyday hats. These were statements. If you saw a woman walking through a hall in a hennin, you didn't make eye contact. You just backed up and hoped she didn't knock over a torch and burn down the castle again. It's worth noting that these absurd fashion choices were still considered indoor headwear. You didn't just throw on a hennin to fetch water or chase a goose. This was reserved for court, banquets, and extremely competitive games of who can be richer without moving their neck. And of course, they didn't go on bare hair. No, no. Underneath the hennin was the coif, the base layer. Still linen. Still tied under the chin. Still the one true constant in a world of shifting dynasties and endless political marriages. Because, as we've established, indoor spaces in medieval manners were not warm. These buildings were stone, drafty, and designed for defense, not comfort. Heat was a luxury. Fireplaces existed, sure, but they didn't do much beyond roasting your shins and leaving the rest of the room in cryogenic stasis. And since windows had no glass, just wooden shutters or fabric covers, you were basically living in a tent made of rocks. So your indoor head covering? It was still your friend. Still keeping your ears from freezing off during the 3rd hour of Massachusetts. Still absorbing the sweat of your daily anxiety. Still hiding the fact that you haven't bathed since the feast of Saint Agatha. Let's follow you through a typical noble day, shall we? Morning prayers. You attend because you must. You're still in your bedrobe, made of wool, lined with something marginally soft, and your coif. You look like a child's drawing of a medieval nun, but no one comments. Everyone looks equally tired. The priest is half asleep. A candle explodes spontaneously. It's fine. Then breakfast. Bread. Cheese. Maybe an egg if someone paid their taxes on time. Your wimple stays on, of course. Not just because of modesty but because of the fleas. You've named 2 of them. They live in the folds near your temple. You've developed a kind of begrudging respect for them. Then comes embroidery, or accounts, or listening to someone recite poetry so terrible it makes your ears try to fold in on themselves like ashamed turtles. Through it all, your head remains covered. Because bareheadedness indoors is still a statement, but now, it says something new. It says, I'm either very ill or I've decided to commit social suicide in front of the Duchess. You see, in noble settings, the uncovered head was a sign of intimacy, of privacy. You let your hair down for your maid, your husband, or your mirror. No one else. If someone walked into your chamber and found you without your head covering, the appropriate response was to faint, apologize, and light a candle for the trauma. Hair itself, especially for noblewomen, was often elaborately styled and rarely washed. Instead, it was combed, braided, perfumed, and hidden under layers of linen, silk, and occasionally desperation. Removing your head covering was not relaxing. It was a whole ordeal. And then you had to put the whole thing back on, which involved pins, mirrors, and possibly bribing your maid with imported almonds. And what about men? Noblemen indoors also wore head coverings, but the styles were a bit more flexible. You might wear a soft cap, a padded hood, or something called a chaperone, which was originally a hood and evolved into a bizarre hat-scarf hybrid that looked like a fabric octopus had lost a fight with a windmill. Some noblemen even wore their indoor hats tilted or twisted, just to show how fashionable and relaxed they were. But the point remained, covered head, good. Bare head, suspicious. Unless you were in bed, or shaving, or being crowned king. Now, let's travel to the court. Imagine it. You're standing in a great hall that smells like smoke, wet wool, and ambition. The floor is covered in rushes, meant to absorb filth, though now they mostly exist to trip over. You see dozens of people, lords, ladies, hangers-on, all sporting some form of head covering. The effect is theatrical, like a costume party with too many rules. And the rules matter. Wear the wrong hat to court and you might be laughed at, excluded, or quietly poisoned over the course of 3 months. Because fashion was not frivolous in the medieval world. It was political. It was hierarchical. It was deadly serious. Let's say you're a lady-in-waiting. You're allowed to wear a linen veil, but not silk. Your veil must be white, not dyed, not embroidered, definitely not bejeweled. If the queen sees you stepping out of line, she'll frown. And in noble circles, a frown is worse than a slap. It's a reputation-ruining, marriage negotiation-ending frown that echoes across your social circle like a very polite thunderclap. But if you're the queen, oh, the possibilities. Your head covering isn't just a fashion item. It's a crown of legitimacy. It might include a circlet of gold, a veil of Italian silk, a wimple of such structure it requires engineering. You are less of a woman now and more of a mobile cathedral. People bow as you pass. Birds sing. Fabric rustles like the wings of angels, or at least very expensive moths. And yet, underneath it all, still the coif, still the linen, still the basic, humble, perfectly practical garment that even queens wear under their ostentatious stacks of royal nonsense. Because some things never change. You end the day in your bedchamber. Candles flicker. You remove the outer layers, veil, circlet, maybe even the decorative pins shaped like birds committing tax fraud. But the coif remains. Maybe you loosen it. Maybe. But you don't take it off. Not yet. Not while there's still cold air under the door and a draft sneaking down the chimney like a very disappointed ghost. So you lie down. On a real mattress this time. With feathers. And maybe even sheets. You're covered in luxury. Silk gown. Wool blanket. Head wrap. Because even in the lap of noble medieval luxury, you still don't uncover your head indoors. That would be madness. That would be modern. And we're not there yet. You wake up coughing. At first, you think it's just the usual medieval wake-up routine. You know, phlegm, dust, lingering candle smoke, the smell of someone boiling cabbage somewhere in the building even though it's not breakfast yet. But then you notice something different. You feel watched. You blink against the dim morning light filtering through the wooden shutters. And then you see it, a shadow moving past your door. A tall figure. Wearing a long robe. And a bird mask. Yes, that bird mask. You're in 14th century Europe now. Plague time. You are indoors, thank God. You are covered, as usual. But it's not for fashion. It's not for modesty. It's not even for warmth. Today, your head covering is about survival. Or at least, the illusion of it. Because outside these stone walls, something terrifying is spreading. Something invisible, but very good at killing people. Something that has made people extremely suspicious of fresh air, foreigners, and their own children. This is the world of the Black Death. And you're going to need a hood. Let's back up a bit. It's the mid-1300s. Somewhere between 30% and 60% of Europe's population is about to be wiped out by a bacteria no one understands, carried by fleas no one sees, on rats no one respects. Towns are emptying. Graves are filling. Priests are tired. And fashion is adapting. Because when everyone around you is dying, your choice of hats suddenly becomes very important. You, of course, are not technically ill. Yet. But you're doing your best to stay that way. And so, like everyone else, you've started layering up. Your indoor wear now includes an extra wool hood, a scarf that doubles as a face wrap, and a tiny cloth bag of herbs tied around your neck with twine because apparently smelling nice things is supposed to keep death away. Your house smells like lavender, vinegar, and panic. Remember how head coverings used to be about modesty and class? Those were the good old days. Now, your goal is simply not to inhale someone else's breath. Your coif is still there, yes, tucked safely under a woolen cap. But now it's joined by a dozen other items, not because they're effective, but because they make you feel slightly less doomed. Doctors, or at least people calling themselves doctors, have entered the scene wearing what can only be described as bird cosplay with a side of horror. The infamous plague doctor outfit was not invented immediately, but by the time it appears in the 17th century, it becomes legendary, a long, wax cloak, a wide-brimmed hat, gloves, and of course, the mask. The beak-like mask wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a medieval air filter. The beak was stuffed with dried herbs, spices, and occasionally crushed emeralds if your doctor was rich and deranged. Things like rosemary, camphor, cloves, and juniper berries, all believed to purify the air. Which, to be fair, probably helped you smell slightly better while you watched someone's lymph nodes explode in the next room. This wasn't limited to doctors, of course. Ordinary people began doing something similar. If you were rich, you carried a pomanda, a small, ornate ball filled with fragrant herbs and perfumes, held up to the nose like a medieval vape pen. If you were poor, you tied a cloth soaked in vinegar around your face and hoped for the best. But underneath it all, people still wore their head coverings. Even when fleeing their homes, even when attending mass funerals, even when burning the belongings of the recently deceased, you would still see the familiar layers: coifs, veils, hoods, scarves, caps. The cultural momentum was too strong. Even the plague couldn't wipe that away. Let's look at this from a social standpoint. Imagine you're a widow now. Your husband succumbed last week after a suspicious cough turned into vomiting blood. You buried him in a pit with 40 other people you didn't recognize. You're grieving, you're exhausted, and you're terrified, but you still wrap your hair before stepping outside. Why? Because propriety doesn't die just because the world is ending. Even in times of mass death, head coverings retain symbolic weight. For widows, the mourning veil was a visible sign of status and grief. It wasn't just black, it was long, flowing, layered, draped dramatically, as though your pain could be measured in feet of fabric. The longer the veil, the deeper the grief. And honestly, the more likely you were to trip while escaping a burning building, but that's a risk people were willing to take for fashion. And don't think for a second that men got a free pass. Men's headwear adapted too. Hoods became deeper, almost cowl-like. More men began wearing wide-brimmed hats even indoors, believing they could block contagion. And the chaperone, that hat-scarf hybrid we mentioned earlier, became a default choice for anxious nobles who didn't want their ears exposed to the air. Because apparently, the ears were particularly vulnerable to miasma. Scientific logic was optional in the 1300s. You may ask, did any of this actually help? Of course not. The plague wasn't scared of your herbs. It wasn't stopped by your hat. The bacteria Yersinia pestis was having the time of its microscopic life, partying on fleas and rats, occasionally jumping onto clothing, and gleefully ignoring your woolen defenses. But that wasn't the point. In a world collapsing under the weight of death, people needed rituals. They needed something to do. And covering your head, layering up, tying the scarf tighter, tucking your hair into a linen coif, became a small, tangible act of control. A tiny defiance. A psychological sneeze guard. You needed comfort, too. Indoor spaces, now more than ever, were shared with extended family, neighbors, livestock, and occasionally the town apothecary who refused to leave because he thought the basil on your windowsill had curative properties. It was crowded. It was tense. And it was cold. So you added another layer. Your head became the nesting site of 3, 4, 5 different items. Sometimes it was hard to remember what was on top. You just kept layering until you couldn't feel the draft anymore, or until someone knocked and you had to answer the door, looking like a very serious, very anxious onion. Let's zoom out for a second. Even in parts of the world less affected by the plague or affected in waves over time, the culture of indoor head coverings deepened. Because fear is sticky. It lingers. Even long after the mass graves are sealed and the town square stops reeking of burnt rosemary, people remember. Customs harden. By the late Middle Ages, the headscarf wasn't just modesty. It was memory, a historical echo of what had been lost and what had survived. And yes, it was still deeply gendered. Women were expected to cover their heads more often, more thoroughly, and more symbolically. Men had more freedom, but not total freedom. A man who refused to wear a hat in certain settings might still be accused of disrespect, to the household, to the church, or to the memory of the dead. Some even started sleeping in their hoods. Not joking. In household where people slept communally, parents, children, servants all in the same room, sometimes the same bed, keeping your head covered was not just about warmth. It was about privacy. A soft wool hood could act like a symbolic curtain between you and the dozens of eyes watching you snore through the night. And then came the religious interpretations. You see, after the plague, a lot of people got very into God. I mean very into God. Flagellation, visions, end times predictions, the spiritual energy was unhinged. And once again, the head covering returned as a theological marker. Certain religious movements began enforcing stricter dress codes. Nuns wore tighter wimples. Pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem wrapped themselves like desert monks. Monastic orders began distinguishing themselves not just by robe color, but by headwear, hoods up or down, rounded or pointed, tied or loose. Covering your head indoors, especially during worship or illness, was seen as both a sign of humility and a barrier between you and sin, as though the devil might enter your ears if they were left uncovered. This may sound ridiculous, but you live in a time where most diseases are blamed on sin, most misfortunes are explained by demons, and most indoor spaces smell like spoiled milk. So sure, cover your ears. Just in case. Let's return to you, now. You've made it through another day of plague paranoia. You only heard screaming twice, which is a new low for the week. You helped wash linens in vinegar, sprinkled dried thyme across the threshold, and refused to speak to the traveling friar who asked if you'd like to repent your sins before nightfall. And now, you prepare for sleep. You do not take off your head wrap. You do not expose your hair. You do not even think about showing your scalp to the rafters. You lie down on your straw mattress, different straw from last chapter, equally cursed, and pull the covers over you. Somewhere in the house, someone coughs. Somewhere else, someone prays. You are wrapped, tucked, sealed, like a small, terrified burrito of fear and superstition. And still, you do not uncover your head indoors. Because even now, even with all the changes, even with the world on fire and half the village in the ground, some rules still stand. Some fears linger. And some linens never come off. You wake up in silence. Not quiet. Not peaceful. Silence. The heavy, echoing kind. The kind that hums inside your skull and makes your heartbeat feel like an act of rebellion. You are not in a cottage. You are not in a castle. You are in a stone room that smells of old incense, beeswax, and rules. The bed is hard. The light is dim. The windows are tiny. There is no straw. There is no talking. Congratulations. You've become a monk, or a nun, or an oblate, or a lay brother, or a novice who joined this monastic community because your parents couldn't afford a dowry or because you had a dramatic spiritual awakening during a thunderstorm. Doesn't matter. You're here now. And your head? It's covered. Of course it is. This is God's house. You think He wants to see your hair? Let's begin with a truth. Monastic life was the Super Bowl of head coverings. If the rest of medieval society wore head wraps for warmth, modesty, status, or survival, the monks and nuns turned it into a full-blown art form. Or maybe an Olympic sport. If modesty were a battlefield, monks and nuns were its elite troops, trained, disciplined, and aggressively anti-scalp. Step 1. The Rulebook. Every religious order had its own set of dress codes, usually based on the founder's personal opinions about humility, luxury, and how much linen a human being could wear without spontaneously combusting. The Rule of Saint Benedict? Cover your head. The Rule of Saint Clare? Definitely cover your head. The Rule of Brother Marcus just really hates hair? Also valid. If you were a nun, your daily wardrobe included a coif, always the coif, never not the coif. A wimple, tied securely under the chin, covering neck and often the jaw. A veil, usually black or white, depending on your order. Some long, some short, always dramatic. A bandeau, a stiff band to keep the veil from slipping and possibly your thoughts from wandering. Altogether, this created the effect of a head wrapped in sacred origami, layer upon layer of carefully folded linen, each piece symbolizing devotion, humility, and the utter obliteration of vanity. Hair? What hair? Your tonsured scalp or tightly braided plait was a secret known only to God and maybe your cellmate. And even he wasn't looking. Because the point of all this wrapping, tucking, layering, was to remove yourself from the physical world. To erase your body. To mute it. To stop people from thinking about you as a person and start seeing you as a vessel for divine labor. Now let's talk about monks. Monks also cover their heads indoors. It wasn't optional. Even though men generally had more leeway in the wider world, monastic life was stricter. A monk might wear a coif or hood under his robe, a full cowl, the signature overgarment of many orders, with a hood attached, a separate cap for sleeping, and occasionally a thin skull cap beneath it all, just for good measure. Why so many layers? Partly because monasteries were freezing. Stone buildings, minimal fires, drafty corridors. Monks weren't supposed to complain. They were supposed to suffer productively. And that included frostbitten ears. But also, hoods were about separation. When a monk raised his hood, even indoors, it meant, leave me be. I'm contemplating divine mysteries. Or maybe I'm just done with people today. Either way, do not engage. The hood was the original do not disturb sign. In some orders, the hood was worn nearly all the time, even while sleeping. In others, it was only drawn during prayer, meditation, or walking the halls at night. But the symbolism was the same: humility, retreat, surrender. Let's zoom in. You, our freshly initiated monastic sleeper, are lying on a wooden cot. Your bed is simple: no pillow, one thin blanket, maybe a little straw-stuffed bolster if your abbey is feeling generous. You're wearing your nightrobe. And yes, your head is still wrapped. Not for style. Not even for warmth. But because you are never truly alone. The monastery is a place where the sacred exists in every moment, especially the quiet ones. Even in bed, your body is supposed to reflect devotion. Your head is covered because your thoughts are meant to be directed upwards. Hair is vanity. Hair is distraction. Hair is personal. But God doesn't need your personality. He needs obedience. There's something beautifully eerie about it. Imagine waking in the middle of the night for matins, the midnight prayer. You shuffle, bleary-eyed, down a corridor lit by flickering candlelight. Dozens of other figures join you. All wrapped, all silent, all anonymous. No faces, no hair, no identities. Just shadows and hoods. Like ghosts. Or saints. Or both. Even the act of singing is muffled under the weight of fabric. The air is cold. The stone echoes. Your breath fogs before your lips. And your head is still covered. You begin to understand this isn't about rules anymore. It's about transformation. Monastic life doesn't just change your schedule. It changes your form. The person you were, the village girl, the second son, the young widow with nothing left, is gone. What remains is discipline, uniformity, a sacred blankness. But even here, in this place of intense spiritual control, there are distinctions. Higher-ranking monks might have slightly different hoods. Abbesses might wear longer veils. Novices sometimes wore simpler wraps to mark their status. And when someone died, the community would wrap the body, head included, in linen, tucking them into eternity the same way they lived, covered, humble, sacred. Let's not forget the penitents. Not everyone in a religious order was there by choice. Some came for penance. Others were forced. Some took vows of silence. Others of poverty. And all of them, were told to cover their heads indoors. It was control, yes, but also mercy. Because a head covering can be armor. It can protect you from the world, from temptation, from judgment, from your own reflection. In this context, it became a cocoon. You wrapped yourself away from pain, from sin, from desire, from memory. You weren't hiding. You were being remade. Let's fast forward. You're lying down for the last time. Not metaphorically, literally. You've served your abbey for 50 years. You've copied texts by hand, tended gardens, sung psalms, washed floors, whispered prayers into endless walls. And now you're dying. Your sisters or brothers gather. They light a candle. They sing. They pray. And as your eyes close, they do not remove your head covering. They do not lay you down with bare skin. They do not let the wind touch your scalp. They bury you wrapped, head to toe, in the same modest cloth that held your thoughts all those years. You are linen. You are devotion. You are gone. But your covering remains. A sign. A promise. An eternal indoor silence. You wake up in velvet. Which is weird, because you've never owned velvet. And even weirder, it's crimson velvet. Dyed with cochineal beetles, imported from the colonies, stitched by hand, and lined with enough rabbit for to trigger an allergic reaction in an entire Renaissance drama troupe. You are, it seems, rich now. Or at least rich adjacent. The air smells different. Less of dung and dampness, more of rosewater, smoke, and expensive disappointment. The year is somewhere in the late 1400s or early 1500s. The Middle Ages have been declared unfashionable by people who own paintings of themselves. The era is Renaissance. And the head covering? Still very much a thing. It never went away. Not even when people started reading Plato again and pretending hygiene was optional if you wore enough perfume. The head, that glorious, vain, highly political upper body region, is still being wrapped, tucked, sculpted, padded, wired, veiled, and shaded. Indoors, outdoors, during childbirth, during war, even at dinner, especially at dinner. But now, it's become competitive. So before we begin brushing your hair into an elaborate structure that requires scaffolding and religious commitment, go ahead and do the usual. Like the video, subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this sort of weird, sleepy history storytelling. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Bonus points if your head is covered right now. Let's start, as all things do, with Italy. Florence, Venice, Milan. City-states full of money, murder, merchant guilds, and men in tights. Here, the veil has become less about religious humility and more about family branding. Married women wear their hair up and covered, because of course they do, but with style. Braids looped like pastry, silk nets, embroidered caps, translucent veils that barely veil anything, fluttering like a gentle reminder that chastity can still sparkle. If you're unmarried, your hair might be looser, but only within reason. Still, it's expected to be clean, oiled, brushed, and decorated with enough effort to make Michelangelo weak. And if you're noble, there's a very good chance your headpiece involves pearls, wire, and some poor maid crouched behind you threading ribbon through 87 tiny loops for 3 hours. Meanwhile, in France, the hennin still reigns, that iconic cone-shaped head that looks like you're about to receive satellite transmission from God. It's tall, pointed, and often covered in sheer fabric that flows behind like a tragic bridal train. But these are on their way out. Too dramatic. Too 14th century. The French are moving on to rounder styles. Soft hats. Structured veils. The chaperon, a strange hat-coif scarf hybrid that defies explanation, but absolutely covers your head and possibly part of your ego. And in England, things are getting Tudor. Hard, square, geometric. You wake up in a manor house. The air is cold. The fireplace is decorative, meaning it's full of unlit logs and broken promises. Your servant arrives with your gable hood, a stiff, triangular headpiece that looks like a tiny roof for your forehead. It is black. It is rigid. It says, "I haven't felt joy since Henry VII took the throne." Underneath, your hair is yanked up tightly. If you're lucky, it's wrapped in silk. If you're unlucky, it's just pinned until your scalp feels like it's being interrogated. The hood goes over it all, framing your face in the same way an oil painting frames a dead-eyed saint. Is it comfortable? No. Is it flattering? Not unless your cheekbones were forged in battle. But it does let everyone know you are respectable, pious, and probably not plotting treason, yet. Men, for once, are equally burdened. They're still covering their heads indoors. Especially in court, church, and anywhere someone might accuse them of having dandruff. But instead of veils, they've moved on to caps, soft, round, occasionally puffed, often trimmed in fur. The scholar's cap, the merchant's cap, the cap of maintenance, the cap of yes, I'm wearing a dead stoat on my scalp. What of it? The variety is endless. Flat caps, tall caps, bonnet-like caps, velvet berets, and the occasional feather that screams, I'm overcompensating for something, but let's pretend it's just wealth. Hats are no longer just modesty accessories. They are now weapons of status. And every detail matters, the color, the fabric, the lining, the badge. Is it trimmed with sable or with rabbit? Is the feather peacock or goose? Are you wearing it tilted jauntily, or dead center like a judgmental librarian? Because one misplaced hat could mean social death. Now, let's talk about indoor etiquette. If you're a noble, taking your hat off indoors depends entirely on the hierarchy. If your host outranks you, you remove the hat. If you outrank them, you might keep it on, like a passive-aggressive crown. In church? Off. At court? Depends who's watching. During dinner? On again, unless you're Henry VIII and decide the rules no longer apply to your swollen, gouty head. But for women, the head covering remains permanent. You do not uncover your hair in front of strangers. You do not show up at a feast with your locks flowing freely like a woodland sprite unless you're trying to get beheaded or married in under 10 minutes. Why so intense? Because, like everything in this era, appearance equals morality. And morality equals control. The hair, especially women's hair, is still considered dangerously seductive. Exposed hair could imply availability, indecency, witchcraft. At best, poor taste. At worst, heresy. So you keep it covered. Indoors, outdoors, in sickness, in health, in labor, in bed. Yes, even in bed. Nightcaps become standard for both sexes. For women, they're soft linen coifs, tied under the chin, often ruffled or embroidered. For men, they're usually plain, rounded, and designed to prevent the dreaded night air from sneaking in and turning you into a corpse before sunrise. The concept of night air, by the way, is real. People genuinely believe that the nighttime atmosphere could cause illness, especially if it touched your head. So your options were, wear a nightcap or risk being smothered by invisible death fog. Easy choice. Now, let's go downstairs. You're attending a Renaissance banquet. Tapestries on the walls. Roasted peacock on the table. Someone's playing the lute too loudly. Everyone smells vaguely of cloves, sweat, and candle smoke. And every single person's head is covered. Women wear French hoods now, curved, elegant, more forgiving than the earlier gable versions. They show a bit of hair at the front. Just a little. Enough to say, yes, I read poetry, but no, you may not touch me. Men? Their caps are feathered and furred. Some wear hoods loosely around their shoulders like fashion scarves. A few brave and very rich ones experiment with bare heads, but it's a risky move, one false draft, and it's pneumonia season. Children, too, are not spared. Little girls wear soft coifs or ribbon caps. Little boys get smaller versions of adult hats, which often look like pastries glued to their heads. It's all very dignified and completely impractical. Now you may be wondering, with all these layers, what happens when people travel or work? Same thing. The head stays covered. If you're a working-class woman, you wear a kerchief or linen wrap. If you're a mun in the trades, you wear a cap or a hood. If you're a servant, your covering reflects your role, plain, clean, symbolic of obedience. Your head is your resume, and it's always on display. Even during childbirth, head coverings were worn. Not because they made pushing out a baby easier, but because no one was about to let modesty slide just because life was literally bursting into the room. And as for illness, well, the plague is still around. So are fevers, poxes, and 1,000 unnamed ailments with symptoms like humors out of balance and being slightly melancholy. Head coverings become part of the sickbed uniform. Some believe they help contain heat, others that they prevented bad vapors from escaping the skull. Either way, your head remains swaddled in a loving embrace of linen until death or recovery, whichever came first. But let's not end on illness. Let's end on something lighter. Imagine you're at a masquerade. The Renaissance is now sliding into the Baroque era. The wigs are coming. The masks are jeweled. The indoor head coverings have reached their peak absurdity. Your cap is made of brocade. Your veil has been replaced by a beaded net that weighs more than your dignity. And for one night, nobody knows who's under all those layers. Which is kind of poetic, isn't it? Because for centuries, people have covered their heads indoors not just out of modesty or law or fear, but to transform, to protect, to signal who they are or who they want to be. And in this moment, under candlelight and music, surrounded by strangers in masks, your head is still covered. But now, for once, you feel seen. You wake up beneath 37 pounds of hair. You don't remember how it got there. You certainly didn't grow it yourself. But here you are, upright, slightly leaning from the sheer weight of your coiffure, neck muscles trembling like a poorly strung lute. You are now a person of means, of leisure, of powdered deceit and towering ambition. Welcome to the 18th century. The wigs have arrived. Your head covered? Yes, obviously. Except now it's not a modest linen veil or a religious hood. It's not even a cap made by a sensible trad esposa in York. Your head is now covered with something that once belonged to a horse's tail, soaked in lye, bleached, curled, set with wax, and styled by a man named Pierre who charges more than your cook. This is the era of the periwig, the poof, the fontange, and the spectacular breakdown of everything your medieval ancestors once called humility. And yes, even indoors, your head must remain extravagantly covered. In fact, especially indoors. Outside, it might get ruined by rain. Indoors, it is a shrine, a performance, a vertical declaration that your scalp is above the law. Let's talk about how we got here. Because remember, not all head coverings are created equal. In previous centuries, they were mostly about three things: piety, practicality, and plague. Now, they're about power, social clout, the theater of excess. You are no longer covering your head because you're cold or humble or God told you to. You're doing it because everyone else at court is literally stacking fruit bowls on their head and pretending it's fashion. And if you don't play along, you are nobody. Let's begin, naturally, in France. You open your eyes in Versailles. Gold. Everywhere. Gilded cherubs stare at you like judgmental pigeons. The air smells of musk, candle wax, and powdered skin. The year is 1772. The throne is occupied by Louis XV, a man who wears rouge, lace cuffs, and enough hair product to cause a minor fire hazard. Your job? To be noticed. Your tool? The wig. For men, the style is still rooted in earlier Baroque tradition. White or gray powdered wigs, shoulder-length, rolled curls along the sides. Occasionally tied back with a black ribbon, because nothing says sober governance like a hairstyle that takes 4 servants to maintain. These wigs are not optional. They are mandatory, at least for the elite. Judges, lawyers, court officials, they all wear wigs indoors, regardless of weather, sense, or dignity. Even children at elite schools wear tiny powdered wigs to class, like they're miniature Voltaire interns. Why? Because the wig has become institutional. It symbolizes order, rank, decorum. Nothing says, "I respect the judicial process," like wearing someone else's hair on your skull. And yes, people wore these indoors all day long, in full rooms with fireplaces, corsets, and no concept of airflow. Because removing it would be considered uncouth, informal, practically criminal. Unless you're at home, behind closed doors, with no visitors, the wig stays on. Now, let's be honest, a powdered wig is less of a head covering and more of a portable sauna for your face. The base is made of woven fabric or leather. The hair, horsehair, human hair, goat, or yak, is curled with hot tongs and set with lard, flour, and pomade. You sleep on an incline to protect it. You scratch it with a special long-handled tool to avoid disturbing the structure. And if you're lucky, you only get one family of lice. For women, it gets worse. You sit before a mirror. Your maid arrives carrying what can only be described as scaffolding. Wire, gauze, padding. Your natural hair is pulled up, curled, and then artificially extended with post-stitches, essentially wig inserts, built up and out into a poof, the towering monstrosity that could hit the chandelier if you're not careful. Once the base is secured, your stylist, let's call her Madeline, because all terrifying things deserve a gentle name, begins adding embellishments. Feathers, pearls, lace, flowers, a miniature model ship. Yes, a ship. With sails. Because in this century, head coverings for elite women have become sculptural. You are carrying an art exhibit on your head, indoors, at dinner, while trying to pretend your neck isn't dislocating in real time. And what's truly spectacular is that this is normal. The famous pouf à la belle poule, worn in 1778, commemorated a French naval victory by placing a replica of the battleship Belle Poule in a woman's hair, complete with sails, and a tricolor flag. Just imagine the conversations. Oh yes, the lamb is delightful. And did I mention I'm wearing maritime patriotism in my curls? This was political, performative, compulsory. Because in a world of salons and status, your hair, or the towering, bird-infested fortress sitting on top of it, was a signal of your wit, your fashion sense, your allegiance. You didn't just cover your head. You turned it into a billboard. And you had to do this every day. Indoors, with an audience. Now, not everyone lived like this. If you were working class, you did not wear a foot-tall wig with a ship in it. You wore a bonnet, a scarf, a linen cap. You still covered your head, because centuries of social conditioning and health beliefs told you that an uncovered head indoors was vulgar, dangerous, or simply not done. But your covering was practical, cleanable, Reasonable. And it smelled significantly less like rendered animal fat. Even so, the elite fashion trickled downward. Tavern girls might wear a little frilled cap with ribbons. Maid servants might starch their caps to mimic their mistresses. And if you were lucky enough to own a single feather, you stuck it on top and hoped nobody noticed your hemline was unraveling. But let's not forget the church. In Catholic Europe, the church still expected modesty, especially from women. Married women, in particular, were expected to keep their heads covered inside the church and often even at home. Even in Protestant regions, modesty retained its grip. The Quakers, for instance, insisted on simple caps for women worn at all times. These were not powdered, not decorated, just plain white linen, tied under the chin, like a shrunken parachute of guilt. And in Orthodox communities, the tradition of the tichel or headscarf continued, plain, structured, constant. As always, the relationship between hair and holiness remained tangled and deeply personal. Now, what about indoors at night? Surely then people let their heads breathe? Oh, sweet summer child. Of course not. Nightcaps remained a universal tradition. Both men and women wore them. They were soft, close-fitting, and typically made of cotton or flannel. For women, they often featured a bit of lace or ribbon. For men, they were shaped like little cones, flopped over to one side like an exhausted pastry. They served several purposes. Warmth. Houses still didn't have central heating. Head equals heat loss equals no thanks. Cleanliness. You spent 3 hours getting your wig styled. You don't want to ruin it. Politeness. Heaven forbid a servant walks in and sees your scandalously bare head. Now, let's peek into a late-night salon gathering. You are indoors at a candlelit soiree. Philosophers, composers, possibly a guy named Wolfgang who keeps signed the piano. Everyone is sipping wine, and everyone's head is covered. The men in powdered wigs, the women in towering poofs with tiny gardens sprouting from a crown. There is no casual here, no relaxed hair-down moment, only posture, perfume, and headwear that violates common sense. But the decadence was beginning to crack. The end of the 18th century brought with it a little thing called the French Revolution, during which wigs fell out of fashion, mostly because the heads beneath them were falling off. The elaborate styles were suddenly seen as symbols of oppression, of aristocracy, of being very, very out of touch with reality. And as people turned toward liberty, fraternity, and simpler bread-based concerns, they began to embrace simplicity in dress. Natural hair came back. Modest bonnets returned. Even the fashion-forward realized that carrying a diorama of the Battle of Trafalgar on your skull might be a bit much. But the habit of covering your head indoors? Still there, deeply embedded, especially among women. Modesty, tradition, the chill of night air, the discomfort of bareheaded vulnerability. These things don't vanish overnight, especially when they've been braided into culture for centuries. And now you lie in bed, wearing a linen nightcap. You can finally remove the powdered monstrosity, but your scalp feels ghostly, cold, like it's been forgotten by God. So you tie the soft cap beneath your chin. It smells of lavender and starch. Your head is finally free, but still wrapped. Because that's what people do. They cover their heads, even indoors, even when the reason is long forgotten, even when the ship has sailed. Literally, it's what's done. You wake up in a corset. Again. This is becoming a problem. At some point in the night, someone has redrawn the world, and it now smells like coal smoke, wet wool, and a mild suspicion of tuberculosis. You're in the 19th century now, which means your hair is oiled, your moral code is rigid, and your head is, naturally, covered. You are indoors, of course. Where else would you be? Outside is a crime scene made of soot and horse droppings. Indoors is where you wear your finest, your polished boots, your least sullied gloves, and, yes, your best indoor bonnet. It is the age of modesty, the age of progress, the age of unwashed industrial regret. And it is absolutely not the age of letting your hair hang out in the parlor like some kind of libertine. No, my dear, that hair is a private matter. And if you think you're taking off your head covering just because you stepped inside, then you clearly don't understand Victorian values. Or fleas. Let's set the scene. You're in London, or maybe Paris, or possibly a coal-dusted village called Shrewsbury that smells faintly of burned cabbage and repressed emotions. It's the year 1852. The world is halfway between witch hunts and light bulbs. Queen Victoria is on the throne, mourning her dead husband in black lace and unwavering sadness. And if you are a respectable woman, and I'm assuming you are because you're awake, dressed, and not in jail, then your head is covered. Not just for church. Not just for funerals. Always. Why? Let's unravel this mess slowly, like the 12 pins holding your hairnet in place. First, modesty. The Victorians were obsessed with it. You've probably heard the cliches, piano legs covered for decency, tablecloths reaching the floor so men didn't get ideas, and while those are only mildly exaggerated, the attitude behind them wasn't. A woman's hair, according to 19th century wisdom, was among her most intimate features. Loose hair was for children, or insane asylums, or artfully undone portraits of sinners in oil paintings your husband wasn't supposed to enjoy. For a grown woman to leave her hair uncovered and flowing indoors, unless she was in the bath or brushing it for her husband in a Victorian fever dream, was scandalous. Even in private, many women kept their heads covered unless preparing for bed. And even then, they often wore soft nightcaps, lest their hair escape into the wild. Second, practicality. The 1800s were not a clean time. Industrial cities were loud, filthy, and filled with airborne particles that defied explanation. Soot, smoke, coal dust, and disease particles floated invisibly through the air, looking for something nice to stick to. And what better surface than your freshly pomaded, middle-parted chignon? So head coverings, even indoors, provided a level of cleanliness, or at least the illusion of it. Your lace day cap? It keeps your hair from catching stray ash flakes and harboring whatever mystery illness your butler has this week. Because remember, this is before shampoo. You might wash your hair once every few weeks, a true spa moment involving vinegar rinses, combs with questionable hygiene, and a basin filled with water you absolutely cannot let the maid know you've spilled. In between washes, your hair is dressed with oils, tonics, powders, and pomades. These make you smell like a blend of gardenia, disappointment, and whale blubber, but they do keep your scalp from flaking into oblivion. And they must be protected. So, the day cap, the indoor bonnet, the mob cap, these became staples of 19th century womanhood. They were lightweight, made of cotton or lace, and they covered your hair neatly without crushing the style. You wore them during breakfast, in the drawing room, while writing letters. You might have a nicer one for visitors, maybe with a ribbon, maybe even a tiny rosette. But the point is, your head was never naked. To be bareheaded indoors would suggest that you either just woke up, were preparing for bed, or, God forbid, work for a living. And while yes, you technically did work all day managing the household, sewing, enduring the agonies of petticoats, and smiling politely at your neighbor's taxidermy collection, none of that counted. Not if you were a lady. Now, if you were working class, your head covering was more practical than ornamental. A housemaid wore a simple cap to keep her hair out of food and fire. A laundress tied hers back with a kerchief. Factory girls might wear a scarf or just braid their hair tight, but the idea was the same: control, tidiness, protection from the blackened wrath of Victorian air. Even children wore caps indoors, at least in the wealthier classes. Tiny lace things with ruffles and ribbons, because nothing says let's ruin a toddler's nap like making them sleep in a fabric jellyfish strapped to their head. And what about men? Yes. Let's not forget them. By the mid-1800s, the days of court wigs were long gone, decapitated, metaphorically, by the Enlightenment and literally by the guillotine. But that didn't mean men stopped covering their heads. Indoors, respectable men, especially older ones, often wore soft caps. Not flamboyant ones. Just modest nightcaps, often cone-shaped, that looked like a cross between a sleeping gnome and a rejected Christmas ornament. Why? Again, warmth, modesty, avoidance of lice, and for some, baldness denial. You're 62. You've got a mustache that droops like a tired caterpillar and a scalp as bare as a sermon. You wear your indoor cap with pride. No one needs to know what's going on under there. It's your business. Let the young fools parade their side parts and pomade. You've got a nice wool flannel dome hugger and a legacy of seasonal bronchitis to protect. Now, we cannot ignore mourning culture, because it played a huge role in how people covered their heads indoors during this era. Let's say your cousin dies. You are now, socially, required to mourn. Publicly, visibly, often for months. Or years? And what do you wear during mourning? Black, obviously. Heavy fabrics. No jewelry, unless it's made of jet or their actual hair woven into a brooch. Yes, really. And on your head? A black mourning veil. This veil is not just for church or funerals. It is worn indoors, during visits, during meals, during reading sessions beside your melancholy potted fern. It is oppressive, hot, and occasionally causes fainting. But it is a symbol. And symbols are not about comfort. Even widows were expected to wear a full mourning veil for the first year or two. Indoors. Even when no one else was around. Why? Because grief, in Victorian England, was a full-time occupation. And your head, like your heart, needed to be fully shrouded in it. There was also a booming mourning fashion industry, tailors, milliners, and veil makers who specialized in grief couture. Because nothing says "I miss you dearly" like spending £4 on a crepe head wrap that makes you look like a funereal cupcake. And it wasn't just England. In continental Europe, especially in Catholic regions, women continued to wear lace veils or mantillas indoors during religious observances. In Spain and Italy, the tradition of the black lace head covering, often paired with a high comb called a pineta, persisted in both church and formal settings. It was modest, elegant, and incredibly itchy. Now, let's not forget the fashion world, which was evolving at a terrifying pace. By the mid to late 1800s, women's indoor headwear became codified. You had specific caps for specific times of day. A breakfast cap, simple, lacy, tied under the chin. A day cap, often with frills, for receiving visitors. An evening cap, lighter, daintier, with tasteful sparkle. A nightcap, soft cotton or silk, for sleep. Each of these had rules. Each was a marker of taste, class, and moral status. Because in a society obsessed with categorizing everything, from your cutlery to your emotional responses, your headwear was yet another box to tick. You could not, for instance, wear your evening cap to breakfast. That would suggest laziness, or madness, or worse, French influence. Let's not even get started on what happens if you appear in the drawing room without a cap. Scandal. Whispers. Your second cousin faints onto a fainting couch specifically built for such moments. Of course, these traditions started to shift near the turn of the 20th century. Women's rights. Changing roles. The invention of actual shampoo. Hairstyles became shorter, less sculpted. The Gibson girl emerged, confident, bouffant-haired, sometimes even hatless. Indoors. In public. But we're not there yet. Right now, it's still the 1800s. Your hair is pinned. Your bonnet is tied. Your cap is laced. You sit by the fireplace, reading poetry about lost innocence and cholera. The air smells like coal smoke and lavender sachets. The candle flickers. Your head is covered. Because it must be. Because tradition said so. Because it's proper. Because somewhere, Queen Victoria is still watching. You wake up in a room with electricity. You don't know how it got there. You didn't light a candle. You didn't crank a handle. But the light is on, steady, humming, mercilessly bright. And you can see a reflection in something called a mirror, framed in chrome, sitting on a vanity made for touching up eyeliner instead of praying. It's the 20th century now. And everything is about to unravel, including your head coverings. The wig is gone. The lace bonnet has vanished. The velvet toque is in a museum somewhere. And you have a bob haircut. A real one. Scandalous. Straight across. Maybe even with bangs, depending on how hard you partied in 1926. But here's the surprise. Even in this brave new century, people still cover their heads indoors. 4 reasons. Real reasons. Fashion, grief, protection, politics. But what changes now, what finally begins to shift, is that for the first time in a millennium, it becomes a choice. Let's rewind a bit. The year is 1905. You're standing in a boarding house in Boston. The furniture is dark wood. There's a phonograph in the corner. You are wearing a corset that's slightly more humane than your grandmother's, a skirt that brushes your ankles, and a hat so wide it could block a solar eclipse. That hat? You don't take it off indoors. Not yet. In the Edwardian era, women's hats were colossal. Feathers, ribbons, stuffed birds, yes, actual ones, silk flowers. If you can glue it to a hat, it's fair game. And etiquette is very clear. Hats are worn indoors in public spaces, restaurants, lobbies, offices, transit, church. Why? Because hats now signal fashion and status, not just modesty. You paid for that ostrich plume. You're not removing it to sip tea. You wear it like armor. You perch it on your Gibson girl updo and tilt your chin accordingly. For men, the rules are the opposite. Men remove hats indoors. Always. In private homes, at restaurants, in the office. It's polite. Respectful. A sign you understand boundaries and walls. You can wear your hat in public transit or a train station, but not in the dining car. Remove it in an elevator if it's in a private building. Keep it on if it's public. Yes, it's a lot. But so was the Treaty of Versailles. This is when the rules diverge sharply by gender. Men uncover indoors. Women don't. And if you're a woman and you dare walk into a department store bareheaded in 1910, people will assume something is wrong. You're either recently widowed, religiously unmoored, or frighteningly poor. Even your nightwear has a cap. Although it's become more delicate now, silk instead of cotton, lace instead of starch. Soft. Whispery. For boudoir dreams and cold water flats. Fast forward to the roaring 20s. Everything changes. You wake up in a studio apartment with linoleum floors and a tiny gas stove. You are a flapper. Or adjacent. You own rouge. You've cut your hair short, scandalously so. And your hat? It's a close-fitting bell-shaped cap that hugs your skull like a velvet secret. You wear it indoors. Not because you must, but because you want to. Because it looks good. Because it matches your newfound freedom. Because you just danced until 3 a.m., drank gin from a teacup, and made out with someone named Helen who owns a motorcar. This is when the head covering becomes fully aesthetic. Not religious. Not hygienic. Not even modest. It's fashion, darling. It's style. And for the first time in 1,000 years, you might take it off indoors, at a party, in your apartment, even at work, and nobody screams. The Great Depression brings everything down a notch. Hats remain practical, sober, tidy. Turbans and head wraps become stylish again, often used to cover unwashed hair when shampoo is a luxury. Silk scarves protect curls and waves set with pins and dreams. But then comes war. World War II. Suddenly, everyone, men and women, is covering their heads again. This time, out of necessity. If you work in a factory, you wear a scarf to keep your hair from getting caught in machinery. If you're in the military, you have a cap, beret, or helmet, depending on what your country thinks you're worth. And if you're a woman on the home front, you wear your hair in victory rolls, pinned under a snood or tied with a scarf. Indoors. At work. In bomb shelters. Hats are still worn, but they're shrinking. More functional. Smaller brims. Tighter silhouettes. By 1945, the hat is no longer a towering symbol of fashion. It's an accessory. Optional. Swappable. Then come the 1950s, and indoor head coverings have a brief, glamorous resurgence. You wake up in post-war suburbia. You have lipstick. You have Tupperware. You have a hat with a netted veil you wear to brunch with the neighbors. Jackie Kennedy wears pillbox hats. Dior says femininity is back. Church. You wear a hat. Tea with your in-laws? Hat. Grocery shopping? Maybe a scarf, tied under the chin like a demure Russian grandmother. Sleeping? Still a nightcap, or at least a few hair rollers under a soft wrap. But already, the end is near. Because something irreversible is happening. Culture is relaxing. The 1960s hit like a fever dream. Hair gets bigger, then straighter, then afro, then feathered. And suddenly, the idea of covering your glorious, teased, sprayed, and liberated hair is unthinkable. Hats? Sure, for fashion. Scarves? Maybe, for driving. But indoors? No thank you. You walk into a department store in 1968 without a hat, and no one blinks. You sit down at a dinner table, bareheaded, and no one crosses themselves. You go to church and, okay, maybe your grandma still wears one, but you don't have to. The rules are breaking. The old assumptions dissolving. The women's movement accelerates the shift. Covering your head, especially indoors, begins to look oppressive, not modest. What was once tradition is now a political statement. In some cases, it flips entirely. To cover your head in the 1970s might now signal defiance of modernity, of feminism, of Western fashion. Or, conversely, embrace of identity. The rise of the Black is Beautiful movement sees head wraps reemerge proudly in African American communities. Muslim women begin to reclaim or reinterpret the hijab in modern ways. Orthodox Jewish women wear tichels or wigs by choice, not by compulsion. Sikh men maintain the turban as an expression of pride and faith. And all of this, every headscarf, every pillbox hat, every bareheaded protester, happens indoors, for the first time, on purpose. The 1980s and 90s bring freedom and confusion. Some women wear elaborate hats to church. Some wear nothing. Some cover their hair at night with satin wraps to protect curls, not to guard against demons. Some wear baseball caps indoors because they're cool. Some do it to be left alone. Suddenly, the meaning of head coverings becomes individual, plural, fragmented. There is no longer a single answer to the question, why is your head covered indoors? Because the reasons now range from, it's part of my religion. It's for fashion. I didn't wash my hair. I'm cold. I have cancer. I'm expressing who I am. Because I can. And that, right there, that last one, is everything. After over 1,000 years of etiquette, obligation, and ritual, the 20th century ends with a single, final revolution. Choice. The head covering is no longer a commandment. It is a canvas. Some women cover their heads indoors to honor God. Others do it to honor Beyoncé. Some men wear durags under baseball caps because that's the culture. Some people shave their heads and wear nothing at all because that's the statement. And it's all allowed. For the first time in recorded Western history, the average person can walk indoors, into a shop, a home, a courtroom, with their head uncovered and not be scolded, excommunicated, or arrested. It took us from the fall of Rome to the fall of the Berlin Wall, from nun's coif to cloche hat to chaos. But here we are. You sit on your couch. Your phone lights up. You're watching a video, maybe this one. Your hair is up, or down, or gone. Your head is bare, or covered, or in transition. And no one gets to tell you what that means. You wake up. Again. Still. Always. This time it's in a room with LED lights and a Himalayan salt lamp. There's a houseplant in the corner named Gerald. You're wearing pajamas that cost more than your rent in 1423. And as your phone buzzes with 17 notifications, you realize something profound. You're in the 21st century. And people are still covering their heads indoors. Somewhere, a monk weeps. Somewhere else, a TikTok influencer adjusts their silk bonnet. You open your phone. You're bombarded with options. How to tie a hijab 37 ways. Best satin-lined beanies for natural hair. Head wraps for spiritual protection and vibes. This hack cured my social anxiety, not clickbait. Head coverings aren't gone. They've just mutated. They're everywhere. On red carpets. On trains. In bedrooms. On toddlers. On cats. Some are religious. Some are fashion. Some are hair care. Some are protection from 5G. We've entered the era of hyper-personalized headgear. Let's start with the sleep bonnet. Yes, we've come full circle. The humble nightcap, once worn to stop your scalp from freezing or your lice from wandering, is back. Only now it's marketed as a silk anti-frizz overnight hair protector and comes with affiliate links and influencers swearing it'll save your marriage. You wear it to preserve curls, reduce breakage, and maintain that blowout you paid for in dollars, tears, and heat damage. It's not scratchy wool. It's soft, glossy, Instagrammable silk. And while your medieval ancestors wore nightcaps so they didn't wake up dead of pneumonia, you wear yours so you don't wake up with a bird's nest for hair and existential regret. There's even a gendered angle here. Many black women wear bonnets as part of nightly hair care. Many men, especially with waves or braids, wear durags for compression and style maintenance. And still, people judge. Because the head covering, even now, carries baggage. You post a video in your bonnet. Someone says, "Why are you wearing that indoors?" As if we haven't done exactly that for the last 1,200 years. You wear a head wrap on a Zoom call. Someone at work asks if it's professional. As if powdered wigs made of horsehair were somehow office appropriate. You wear a hijab, or a turban, or a tichel, and suddenly people think they know your politics. You wear nothing, and suddenly people think you've abandoned tradition. The 21st century is full of options, but it's also full of noise. Let's talk about religion, because, shocker, it hasn't vanished. Across the world, billions of people still cover their heads indoors. Muslim women wear hijabs, niqabs, or khimars, depending on interpretation, geography, and community. Orthodox Jewish women cover their hair after marriage, often with a wig called a sheitel or scarf tichel. Sikh men and some women wear the dastar, a turban wrapped with reverence and identity. Some Christians, including traditional Catholics and the Amish, continue to wear prayer veils, bonnets, or head coverings during worship or all day long. Many Buddhist monks shave their heads and wear robes with hoods or wraps as a symbol of humility. This isn't cosplay. This is culture, conviction, continuity. And for many people, it's still indoors where it matters most. In the temple, at the altar, in prayer, in the quiet moments when it's just them and their beliefs, and maybe a space heater. But the world around them? It's noisy, judgmental, and obsessed with choice. Because choice is sacred until it makes someone else uncomfortable. There have been legal battles over headscarves in Europe, debates about religious symbols in public schools, workplace policies that call natural hair or head wraps unprofessional, cities banning masks while influencers sell balaclavas for $80 on Etsy. Meanwhile, your cousin is wearing a beanie indoors for no reason and nobody bats an eye. It's absurd. It's predictable. It's history, just dressed in a hoodie this time. Let's get more personal. You go to bed tonight wearing a sleep bonnet. Why? Maybe you have curly hair. Maybe you spent $90 on a silk pillowcase and want the full experience. Maybe you're reclaiming something, a childhood memory, a cultural connection, a sense of control in a chaotic world. Or maybe you're just cold, and you don't want to get a medieval draft on your scalp and die. Valid. Maybe you wake up and put on a head wrap, a satin-lined turban, a scarf your grandmother taught you to tie when you were 9. Maybe you walk into your living room, and someone says, "Why are you wearing that indoors?" You don't answer. You're too busy sipping your oat milk latte, adjusting your wrap, and preparing to survive the day like the regal, mildly exhausted empress you are. Fashion has taken over where tradition once ruled. Look around. You've got TikTok tutorials for scarf tying, red carpet appearances in custom couture headpieces, YouTube influencers explaining the historical significance of the snood in high definition, designer sleep bonnets that cost more than medieval rent, people buying fake hair just to cover real hair in order to look better on a date where you'll both pretend to be casual and chill. It's the same impulse. Head coverings have always been about presentation, modesty, class, utility, or rebellion. Today, they're all 5 at once. And more. Let's review the modern categories of indoor head coverings. The religious wrap, worn with conviction, or cultural tradition, may include hijabs, tichels, turbans, mantillas, snoods. Indoors because it's sacred space, or because every space is sacred. The fashion hat, berets, newsboy caps, bucket hats, crochet disasters. Indoor usage varies based on confidence, temperature, and whether you're attending a poetry reading. The sleep bonnet, usually satin or silk, designed for hair protection and deep REM sleep with style. Sometimes seen in gas station parking lots before 10 a.m., no judgment. The durag/wave cap, compression headgear for curl definition. Cultural, functional, sometimes politicized. Worn indoors to preserve the waves. Worn outdoors to preserve your peace. The illness covering. Scarves, wraps, or wigs worn due to chemotherapy, alopecia, or medical conditions. A daily reminder that the head covering can be armor, comfort, or disguise, sometimes all three. The identity wrap, worn for cultural pride, ancestral connection, or spiritual alignment, can be wrapped 5 different ways depending on the moon phase and your mood. Often misunderstood, rarely explained, always majestic. And then there's the I don't want to be perceived hat, worn indoors by people who need 10 more minutes of solitude before participating in society. We all have that one. So what's the moral of the story? Simple. We've never stopped covering our heads indoors. We've just changed the fabrics, the meanings, the reasons. Once upon a time, you wore a coif so God wouldn't smite you and your neighbors wouldn't accuse you of being possessed by hair demons. Then you wore a bonnet because Queen Victoria was sad. Then you wore a cloche because flappers were horny and free. Then you wore nothing because shampoo and feminism teamed up. Then you wore silk because your curls were expensive. Now, you wear whatever the hell you want. Indoors, outdoors, upside down. Because the history of head coverings is not about fashion or faith or filth. It's about survival. It's about identity. It's about saying, even without words, this is me, right now, in this moment. Covered, or uncovered, or somewhere in between. So when someone asks, why are you wearing that inside? You can smile softly, adjust your wrap, and whisper, because it's Tuesday, and my scalp has seen things. Good night, scholar. Your head is warm. Your history is rich. Your dreams are protected by 1,500 years of linen, lace, silk, politics, and vibes. Sleep well.